And so we return back to this flip chart where we have now looked at a tool that is going to help us set direction. So we need to move around now to the analysing performance component. And of course, when it comes to analysing performance, there is a challenge with analysing performance, and that is to be able to analyse performance objectively. And of course, the challenge with objectivity lies in the fact that as people, we like to tell stories. We like to hear stories. And nowhere is this more true, of course, than with the whole urban myths side of things, the urban legends. And you might remember we talked about this and we came up with a number of urban myths and urban legends. And after listening to 2 or 3 urban myths, we identified that there's a bit of a pattern with these. First of all, urban myths, urban legends start off with something that is possible, but then there is a wow factor attached to them. There is an emotional hook, and the story needs the emotional hook, otherwise the story won't get retold. If we just tell the story about a friend of mine who went overseas and got really drunk one night after working really hard, the end, the story is not going to get retold. It's not until we add the emotional hook of then he woke up in the morning in a bath full of ice and someone had robbed him of his kidneys that people start to want to retell that story. Now we have a reason to retell. So stories get retold when they are possible and there is a wow factor. Also, urban myths are at least once removed. It's never the person in the room telling us the story. It's always a friend of mine, or quite often a friend of mine. As I said, I've been doing this for many years and I have met lots of people who've sworn that it's a friend of theirs, but I have never met the person that the urban myth is actually about. So urban myths are at least once removed. And the other component of urban myths is that there is an element of confirmation and addition. When people tell these stories to one another, what happens is you get a response like, "Oh, I heard that, and what I heard was," and then people add to it. And this is how urban myths have lived for some of them literally hundreds of years, and they've just been updated as they've gone along. So we identified that the components of urban myths are possible plus a wow factor. They are at least once removed, and there is also an element of confirmation and addition as well. Not dissimilar to your average garden variety corporate rumours. This is how corporate rumours operate as well, is that first of all they'll start off as possible, but there's a wow factor. They'll also be once removed, and when people are told them, there's an element of confirmation and addition. So you get stories about someone in finance told me, I can't tell you who, but at last year's Christmas party the boss got really drunk and later on there was an incident involving women's clothing and all this sort of stuff. And then of course when people hear this, there's the confirmation and addition as well. Well, I wouldn't put it past him because I heard that his parents always wanted a daughter and they used to dress him up and call him Jennifer and all this sort of thing. And next thing we know, we've got a corporate rumour. So you might remember what we did is we gave you 7 minutes of legal gossip time. We started off with some statements and we gave you 7 minutes to toy with those statements, and what we ended up with is value judgments. We started off with provable facts. We started off with the behaviours that we had seen, and we ended up with fiction. We ended up with value judgments. And what this taught us is a couple of things. First of all, the obvious thing is us as managers, if we're going to objectively analyse performance, we need to be very careful of what it is that we are listening to that could be second-hand, that has a wow factor attached to it. We need to be careful. Also, this becomes incredibly insidious when we are listening to a person who we trust, who we respect. So say for the sake of argument that Fred and I might be very good friends, and Joanne reports to me. And Fred and I are at a barbecue one afternoon and we're having a chat away, and Fred says to me, "Dead set, Rod, what's the go with Joanne? She seems a bit lazy." And of course, as you might remember, we talked about the fact that there's a part of your brain called the RAS, the Reticular Activating System. That's not important. What's important is what it does. And you might remember it is a filtering mechanism. It filters out information that we have chosen to be unimportant, and it filters in information that we have chosen to focus on. So, if Fred, my friend, who I respect, says to me, "What's the go with Joanne? She seems a bit lazy," then what I might do is I might go back and watch Joanne's performance through the filter of lazy. And I might filter out 20 things that shows that she's got it together, and then she does one thing, leaves her coffee cup unwashed on the sink. There you go. She is lazy. We need to have a chat about this. And next thing you know, at the next performance appraisal, I'm sitting down with poor Joanne and I'm saying, "Joanne, I've noticed that there's a degree of laziness has crept in over the last couple of months." And of course, what happens is Joanne's going to rightfully get upset. She's going to be asking for dates, faces, names and places. Joanne is going to be asking for behaviours. She's going to be asking for facts, because lazy is a judgment, a value judgment. So if we're going to objectively analyse performance, what we need to be able to do is we need something that's going to help us check whether we are making value judgments or whether we are talking in descriptions of behaviour. We need something that's going to help us move from fiction to fact. And of course, the tool that's going to help us do that is the Behaviour Description Generator. Basically, again, this is a process, a series of questions that we can ask ourselves in order to make sure that we are dealing with behaviours, not value judgments. And you might remember the first step for doing this is to start off with a description, to start off with what it is that we have noticed. Describe the person. And you might remember we used the example of John McEnroe in order to help us work through this. And of course, the obvious description when we think of John McEnroe is, of course, the Brat. That was his nickname. So what we can do is we can use the Behaviour Description Generator to identify the micro behaviours that someone might do in order to lead someone else to describe them as a brat. So describe the person, brat. The next question becomes, can you do that description? Now, you might remember we said, oh yes, there could be some people out there thinking to themselves, oh yeah, Rod, I can do brat for sure. I can do brat really well. You can't really do brat. It doesn't even make grammatical sense to say the phrase, do brat. What you can do is you can do a series of micro behaviours, and when we see these micro behaviours linked together, it may lead someone to describe you as a brat. But you can't do brat. So the answer to that question, can you do that description, is at this stage, no. Which leads us to the next question, which is, what have you seen them do or heard them say that has led you to that description? So the question now becomes, what is it that you have seen John McEnroe do or heard John McEnroe say that has led people to describe him as a brat? And this is where we come up with things like smashed tennis racket on the court. So then we need to ask ourselves the question, can you do that? Can you smash the tennis racket on the court? To which, of course, the answer is yes. So now we have a description of behaviour. Smashed tennis racket on the court. What have you heard him say? You heard John McEnroe say things such as, the ball was in, I'm surrounded by incompetence, you haven't got the brains God gave a mule. These sorts of things are direct quotes, and they are direct quotes. Even if we said something like, he abused the referee, or he swore at the referee, or he argued with the referee. Abused, swore and argued are terms that are open to interpretation. Your definition of swearing and arguing and abusing may be very different to John McEnroe's definition of swearing, arguing and abusing. And if we've got these differences in interpretation, then this is where we do not have a behaviour description. We have a value judgment, and of course we could argue all day about what is concerned, what could be defined as being abuse or swearing or arguing. So we need to take those ones around once again and ask ourselves, what did we hear him say or see him do that led us to believe that he was arguing or abusing the referee? And this is where we come up with direct quotes. This is where we hear things like, he said, "The ball was in, I'm surrounded by incompetence, you cannot be serious." These sort of things are direct quotes, so they are descriptions of behaviour. So what we have now is, instead of saying to John McEnroe, you've got to stop being a brat, what we can now start to do is build our conversation to improve John McEnroe's performance around statements like, "From here on in, John, the following phrases and behaviours are unacceptable. No longer are you allowed to say, 'The ball was in, I'm surrounded by incompetence, you cannot be serious.' No longer are you allowed to smash the drink stand with your tennis racket or smash the court with your tennis racket." If we can get that specific, it becomes far more likely that we're going to change his behaviour. On top of that, if we are able to be equally specific with the behaviours we do want him to exhibit, then we again dramatically increase the likelihood that we will change the behaviours. And you might remember we talked about another tennis player who was around the same time, who was almost the polar opposite of John McEnroe, and that was, of course, Bjorn Borg. He also had a nickname, the Iceborg. And when we put the Iceborg through the behaviour description generator, we end up with behaviours like, what is it that you have seen Bjorn Borg do or heard him say that has led people to describe him as the Iceborg? We end up with behaviours like that when the call went against him, he had a poker face. There was no expression on his face. He would turn around, walk to the back of the court and prepare for the next point without saying a word. So this is how you do Iceborg. So now we can also add to our discussion with John McEnroe, when we come to form it properly, what we can say is we can be equally specific with what we don't want him to do and also what we do want him to do as well. And we asked you to practice this because this is not an easy skill. We need to actually think about this. And we asked you to identify some common words, some common value judgments that you may have used, that others may have used back at work. And we asked you to pop them through the behaviour description generator. Words like lazy, top unit, good communicator, poor attitude, is the full six-pack but lacks the plastic thingy that holds it all together. These sorts of things are, of course, value judgments. So after we put them through the behaviour description generator, we'd identified that there are two approaches to, or two types of behaviours largely, if you like. Behaviours that are associated with competence and behaviours that are associated with commitment. And we identified that if we can split these behaviours into two, it can start to help us work out how to best approach our team members and what approach is going to most likely improve the performance of our team members. So we identified that after we have analysed our team members' performance in terms of their behaviour descriptions, we can then work out whether their behaviour is linked to a degree of competence or whether their behaviour is linked to a degree of commitment. You might remember we talked about people will or won't perform dependent upon two key aspects of their performance: competence, commitment. So some people have a high degree of competence. Competence is all about knowledge. It is about skill. It is about experience and expertise. Some people have a high degree of competence. We know they can do the job. We've seen the results before. They get good results when they apply themselves. It's about have they studied it at university? Have they studied it at TAFE? How long have they been doing the job? All of these things will contribute to a high level of competence. Some people have a low level of competence. The job is new to them. They are new to the job. The job has changed. They do not have a lot of experience with this particular job. And all of those things contribute to a low level of competence. And of course, another aspect of performance that impacts on overall performance is, of course, their level of commitment. Some people have a high level of commitment. And this is all about attitude, it's all about enthusiasm, it's all about willingness. Some people are trying their best, they want to do a good job. Some people have a low level of commitment. You know, as long as the pay is in my account every payday, who cares, sort of thing. And then with aspects of competence and commitment, we can put these on a XY axis. And of course, whenever we get an XY axis, we can start to make a matrix. And the matrix will help us identify the approach that perhaps we might best use with our team members based on an objective analysis of performance as to how we might best improve their performance. So first of all, in the bottom right hand corner, where we have someone who is highly committed and yet at the moment not competent. So the classic example of this, of course, is someone who has just joined our team. You, when you first got your promotion into your role as manager or team leader, chances are you were committed and not yet competent. Great, I got the job, but I don't know how to do it. So the best way to improve a person's performance who wants to do a good job and for some reason does not yet have the competence is, of course, to coach the person. And you might remember we talked about coaching is not training, is not sending them off onto a training course. Training is a subset of coaching. Training is something that I do. Coaching is something that you as a manager needs to do. So coaching, the obvious example of this is to think of a sports coach. And of course, what a sports coach does is they take the person off the field and they get them to practice. That's what's called a training session, where what they do is they have conversations with the person about their performance last week, and they skill and drill. They focus on one aspect of performance and they get them to practice that over and over and over again. You do not just play another game at a coaching session. What you do is you skill and drill so that then when you go back on the park on the weekend where you play your other game, you can now incorporate the new skills into your larger game. And a coach's role is then to observe your performance and work out whether you are applying what was covered in the coaching session or not. If so, fantastic, reward and recognition. If not, then the next training session, we need to again re-skill and drill. It's the same with corporate coaching. We need to take someone off the park, not get them to practice on the job. First of all, we need to skill and drill them. And then once they've skilled and drilled, then we can ask them to practice on the job. Then we've also got team members who are competent and committed. These are your top performers. So the opportunity here is to say thank you in a way that is meaningful to them, is to develop these people. And when we talked about develop, you might remember that there was 3 subsets to the word develop. There was to recognise their performance, perhaps reward their performance, and also to perhaps stretch them as well. And we identified that different people are going to want different amounts of those 3 options. Some people, recognition is enough. Some performance, recognition is enough. Some people, reward is appropriate. Some performance, reward is appropriate. And for some people and for some performance, stretch is what is appropriate. So we need to identify the way to make sure that we're going to hit the nail on the head with this is, of course, to have a conversation with our top performers and to work out what it is that they would like by way of us to recognise their competence and their commitment. We also identified that sometimes some people, high competence, low commitment. These are the people that perhaps the best approach is we need to counsel. And we identified that when we say the word counsel, what often comes to mind is we have extremes of perceptions around counselling. One extreme goes something like, you, my office, pal, you've got an attitude problem and you need to fix it or it's on your bike. All right, I think we're done here, is one extreme of counselling. The other extreme of counselling goes something like, please come in, sit down, in fact, lie down. So tell me, when did all of this start? Oh, well, I was a fragile child of 3 at the time and I had this thing for clowns and my father wouldn't take me to the circus one year and it scarred me for life, is the other extreme of counselling. And obviously we identified that both can be inappropriate dependent upon what is causing the low commitment. So the first step when we are working out how to counsel this person is to give ourselves the best possible chance of identifying what is causing the low commitment. And you might remember that what we did there is we talked about OTFD and using the word I instead of you. And if we start off our counselling session that way, it dramatically increases the likelihood that the person will be honest with us and tell us what is causing the low commitment, and therefore we can determine whether we need to head in that direction or whether we need to head in that direction. And then, of course, there are occasions where we get some people with some tasks where their commitment is low and their competence is low. And we said that the best way to approach this is to reassign. And the reason why we use the word reassign is not because Rod's been in HR far too long, is because it identifies that this is situational leadership. And so therefore our response is dependent upon the situation, and the situation changes every time. You know yourself. You get to work on a Monday morning, you look at your to-do list, the first thing on your to-do list, you look at it, and perhaps for that particular thing, you are highly committed but not competent. So for that task, for that thing, the best way to improve your own performance is to coach. The next task on your to-do list, you look at it and you are competent and you are committed. Great, been looking forward to this and I know how to do it and I love it. Competent and committed. The next task on your to-do list, of course, you may be competent but not committed. If I never have to do this task again in my entire life, I'll be a happy man, sort of thing. And then the next task on your to-do list, you may look at it and you may think to yourself, don't know, don't want to know. In which case you fall into the reassign quadrant yourself. So the reason why we say reassign is an option here is because it reminds us that there is a number of options. First of all, yes, we can reassign the person. Option one is to reassign the person outside of the organisation. That is our first option and we should not shy from that if that is what is required. Option two is perhaps we can reassign them within the organisation. Perhaps we have a square peg in a round hole and somewhere else in the organisation is a square hole begging to be filled, in which case we can reassign them within the organisation. And the third option is perhaps we can reassign the task. Perhaps this person is brilliant at all their other jobs and it is just this one aspect that they're struggling with. And you might remember I gave the example of the sales rep who was a career rep, 200% target where everyone only had 100%. He had 2 territories, everyone only had 1 territory, but his paperwork was dreadful. He was not competent and not committed when it came to his paperwork. So are we going to sack our best revenue producer just because of his paperwork? Foolish. The sales manager at the time, clever kid. What he did is he called in this sales rep and he said to him, I'm going to increase your budget by 50%. When you hit that extra 50%, I'm going to get you a personal assistant. And the personal assistant's role was to do the paperwork for the rep. And so therefore what we were able to do, what the sales manager is able to do, is reassign the task is also an option. And we asked you, we might remember after looking at this particular model, we asked you to think about and analyse the performance of your team.